Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are jumping into a story that feels like it's moving at 100 miles an hour. We're talking about incredible international pressure, diplomatic ultimatums, and a peace framework that's, well, it's pushing the war in Ukraine to a real breaking point.
It really is. The source material you sent over, it paints this frantic picture, almost desperate. Washington seems to be trying to force a U.S.-drafted peace plan on Kyiv, and with a really severe deadline.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that, to really get into this geopolitical squeeze play. We're looking at what's being proposed versus the red lines that Ukraine and its allies have drawn over and over.
And I think President Zelenskyy himself captured the gravity of it all. He said Ukraine is facing a choice between losing our dignity or losing a key ally.
Wow.
Yeah. It's basically survival versus sovereignty. That's the game being played right now.
Okay, so let's start with this U.S.-drafted framework. The pressure coming from Washington is, it's almost unprecedented. The reports say U.S. officials expect to push Zelenskyy into signing.
And it's not just a general push. They've attached a date to it. Former President Trump apparently warned that Thursday is, we think, an appropriate time for Ukraine to accept.
Thursday? That's not a negotiation. That sounds like an ultimatum.
That's exactly how European and Ukrainian officials see it. They're not calling it a peace plan. They're calling it a capitulation.
Because telling a sovereign country they have until Thursday changes everything. But it's not just a suggestion, right? There are threats behind it if Kyiv says no.
Oh, absolutely. The threats are layered, and they're, frankly, existential. First, if Kyiv doesn't sign, the message is they'll face a much worse deal in future.
The terms will get even tougher.
Exactly. But the immediate threat, the one that really bites, is that U.S. officials have reportedly threatened to cut vital intelligence sharing and weapons supplies.
And that's the absolute linchpin. For a country that depends on U.S. intelligence for targeting, for battlefield awareness. What does that even mean in practical terms?
It means they go blind.
Right.
It's strategic blindness. Their ability to conduct a sophisticated defense, to hit Russian targets, to even protect their own cities. So much of that relies on U.S. satellite and signals intelligence. Cutting that off isn't just slowing them down. It's like taking away their eyes and ears overnight.
Which makes that dignity or ally choice not really a choice at all.
Not when it comes to immediate survival, no.
And this message was delivered pretty forcefully to the rest of the allies, wasn't it? By U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll.
It was. He briefed the NATO ambassadors, and his message was stark. He basically said, no deal is perfect, but it must be done sooner rather than later. It was a clear signal to everyone. This is happening. Get in line.
Okay, so that's the hammer. What about the plan itself? The 28-point plan. Let's get into the provisions that have everyone calling this a capitulation.
The biggest one, the one that's just, impossible for Kyiv, is about territory. It requires Ukraine to cede land.
Okay, but let's be specific, because the details here are absolutely crucial.
Right. It's not just about giving up territory that Russia has already occupied, which would be a massive concession on its own.
There's more.
The plan reportedly demands that Ukraine surrender further territory that Kyiv still controls.
Wait, so they'd have to hand over land that hasn't even been lost on the battlefield?
If the reports are true, yes. It's a forced territorial loss beyond the current front lines. It would essentially legitimize Russia's aggression and reward them with strategic areas they haven't even managed to secure.
That's a whole different level. It's not a ceasefire. It's a forced redrawing of the map. What else is in there? What about their military, their future?
Well, the plan also supposedly demands that Ukraine accept permanent limits on its military.
So a neutralized state.
A neutralized and militarily constrained buffer state. And, of course, it would require them to permanently renounce any ambition to join NATO. That's been a core Russian strategic goal for decades.
And then there's the part that just seems designed to be a poison pill, the issue of war crimes.
Yes, this is maybe the most shocking part, especially for international law. The plan proposes a blanket amnesty for all war crimes committed during the conflict.
For all war crimes,
Absolutely.
By both sides.
For all of them. It's just staggering. It would completely short-circuit any kind of justice process, any accountability. It suggests that the priority is just a quick political exit, no matter the moral cost.
If Kyiv signed that, it's basically saying aggression on a massive scale can wash away any subsequent atrocities. That has implications way beyond Ukraine.
It absolutely does. Now, to be fair, we should note the plan isn't a total giveaway to Moscow.
Right.
There are some things in there Moscow might not like. It supposedly requires Russian forces to pull back from some of the areas they've captured.
But the balance of concessions is overwhelmingly on one
Oh,
side.
completely. The burden is squarely on Kyiv.
Hmm.
And that brings us back to Zelensky's reaction. He called it one of the most difficult moments of our history. He argued that signing this would leave Ukraine without freedom, dignity, and justice.
Which is completely understandable. So it's no surprise that the Allies, especially in Europe, pushed back hard. Tell me about this nightmare meeting with Secretary Driscoll.
One diplomatic source called it exactly that, a nightmare. Apparently, the U.S. argument was brutally simple. They just kept repeating the "you have no cards" line.
The idea that Ukraine has no leverage left.
Right. And European ambassadors were reportedly furious, not just at the terms, but at the secrecy of it all. They felt the U.S. had negotiated this with Russia completely behind their backs.
And that secrecy makes sense when you look at how this framework was reportedly born.
It does. This didn't come from multilateral talks. The sources point to a meeting last month in Miami, of all places, between Trump administration representatives like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and a Russian envoy named Kirill Dmitriev.
And Dmitriev is under U.S. sanctions.
He is under U.S. sanctions. So you have a sanctioned Russian envoy meeting with top American political operatives to draft a peace plan. That's the origin story here.
No wonder the Europeans felt strategically sidelined, betrayed even.
Exactly. And you saw them mobilize immediately at the G20 summit in Johannesburg. This wasn't just quiet grumbling, it was a coordinated countermove.
So who was involved in that scramble?
You had UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, France's Emmanuel Macron, and Germany's main opposition leader, Friedrich Merz.
Merz's involvement is really significant. It shows this wasn't just a left-right issue. It was a pan-European front.
It was. And after a call with Zelenskyy, they put out a collective statement. It made two key points. First, any plan needs joint support and consensus from European and NATO allies.
In other words, you can't go around us.
Precisely. And second, that any deal had to take Ukraine's principled positions into account. They were effectively building a diplomatic wall around Kyiv.
So they weren't trying to kill the U.S. plan outright, but to, reshape it.
I think that's the perfect way to put it. One European diplomat said they are working on making the U.S. plan something more able to be applied. They're trying to revise it, to pull it back from being a forced capitulation before that Thursday deadline hits.
What about other key players in the region? Poland, for instance.
Polish President Karol Nawrocki was very clear. He insisted that because Ukraine was the victim of aggression, Ukrainians must have the decisive voice. It's the same principle. Empower Kyiv. Slow this down.
And what did Putin have to say about this U.S. plan? I imagine he was quite pleased.
Of course. He used it as a tool to put even more pressure on Kyiv. He said Ukraine is being unrealistic and living under illusions if it rejects the plan. His positive reaction just confirmed for everyone else that the deal was heavily tilted in Moscow's favor.
Okay, so while all this high-pressure drama is unfolding, there's a really fascinating and successful bit of parallel diplomacy happening. And it involves a surprising player, Belarus.
This is such a great counterpoint to the main story. Amid all this tension, Ukraine announced that 31 of its civilians were being freed from jail in Belarus. Some had been sentenced for up to 11 years.
And Kyiv was very specific about who they thanked for this.
They were. Their prisoner exchange committee put out a statement saying, "We express our gratitude to the United States of America and President Donald Trump for their fruitful work."
So Trump was involved in a completely separate back channel. How did that work?
Well, according to Belarusian state media, the pardon was a direct agreement between President Lukashenko of Belarus and President Trump.
And there was a quid pro quo.
There was. In exchange for the prisoners, Washington partially lifted sanctions on Belarus's state airline, Belavia, so they can now service their planes, including their Boeings.
So direct transactional diplomacy still works, even in this environment.
It shows that there are still avenues for progress, completely outside of this huge, contentious peace framework.
But we have to remember, the fighting on the ground doesn't stop for any of this. What's the latest from the battlefield?
The front lines are still shifting. The Russian Defense Ministry just claimed they captured 2 more villages, one in Donetsk and one in Zaporizhzhia. The map is changing every single day.
And Ukraine is still hitting back deep inside Russia.
Yes, a recent Ukrainian drone attack targeted energy facilities in the Samara region. It reportedly killed 2 people in Syzran. So Ukraine is still demonstrating that it can impose costs far from the front.
But the cost for civilians inside Ukraine, especially with winter setting in, Must be brutal.
It is. Sources from cities like Chernihiv say people are without power for up to 14 hours a day. They're gathering in what the government calls invincibility points.
Can you just explain what those are? Because it really illustrates the day-to-day reality.
They're basically fortified community hubs. They have generators for power, Wi-Fi, food, heat, medical supplies. They're not just shelters, they're lifelines. They show how basic survival has become the main challenge for so many.
So when we put all of this together, the deadline, the concessions, the European pushback, the human cost, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, in this moment?
I think the takeaway is just the sheer velocity of it all. You have this intense, imposed deadline from Ukraine's most important ally demanding these profound concessions, and it's being met by this unified, principled resistance from European partners who see the danger in a forced peace.
And it brings us right back to where we started, that central question. Will Kyiv's need for its key ally and all the weapons and intelligence that come with it override its fight for dignity, for freedom, and for justice? It is the ultimate test.
And it raises a bigger question, really, about the future. If a major power can just unilaterally draft a peace deal with an aggressor and bypass both the victim and its other allies, what does that mean for shared security, for multilateralism?
That is the challenge. And to leave you with one final thought to mull over, think about the strategic impact of this plan, even if it fails, even if Thursday comes and goes. By putting a framework on the table that includes territorial losses and war crimes amnesty, the U.S. has fundamentally moved the goalposts for any future talks. It has, perhaps inadvertently, legitimized Russia's starting position, making any future deal that much harder for Ukraine to accept without it feeling like capitulation. That pressure isn't going away.